So my name is David Fridovich-Keil. I am an assistant professor at UT Austin in the aerospace engineering department. So I was a graduate student. I did my PhD at UC Berkeley in electrical engineering, and it's combined with computer science there. And I did my undergraduate degree in electrical engineering at Princeton.
Wow, that's really impressive. So, how did you get interested in research in the first place?
So actually, both of my parents are professors, so I kind of knew that research was something that people did, growing up. I knew it was an option, but had, basically no exposure to it until college. In college, I did what's called a research experience for undergraduates, REU program after my freshman year. And that exposed me to a bit about what research was, but I wouldn't really say I got a direct kind of more personal experience driving a research project until a little bit later in college, actually in the same lab. So anyway, in college, I think I had some idea of what research was, but I had no exposure really to the publication side of research, or I had no ambition to publish the research or anything like that. And I got exposed to that part of it in graduate school.
Okay. So, in understandable terms to a high schooler, could you give me a quick overview of your research?
Certainly. So I think the easiest way to describe at least most of the bulk of what we do in my lab is we try to understand how multiple decision makers interact over time. And we do this using the language of game theory. So if you play chess or something like that, you'll be familiar with thinking of the procedure of how you make a move is you think about, if I make this move, the board will look like something else when my opponent has to react. And my opponent is going to consider a bunch of possible moves. I'll also plan of how I might react. And this is kind of going to repeat and nest over time. So we basically try to formulate problems, express scenarios that you and I deal with in our daily lives, say driving on the road, navigating an intersection, generating electricity and putting it on the power grid, buying a share of some company, any of these things as a decision that we can make repeatedly over time, which requires us to reason about how others are going to react to our decisions. So we trained all those types of problems as what are called dynamic games played over time, and then develop algorithms to solve them efficiently for whatever the application we have in mind is.
Okay, that's really cool. So, what's the biggest challenge that you faced in research, and also how did you overcome that challenge?
That's actually quite a deep question. I certainly have faced my share of challenges, and I'm sure there are many more to face. I think 10 years ago, if you'd asked me this question, what I would have told you is the biggest challenge is actually solving the technical problem in front of me, right? So if I'm faced with, the very first research exposure I had was, like I said, in college, this research experience for undergraduates after my freshman year. Like the big thing that I was doing was testing out a bunch of new lasers and trying to kind of characterize their performance and how much light they emitted versus the energy we were pumping in. So, that involved a lot of things. I was an expert in none of them, and I had to learn a fair amount to even understand what I was trying to do. And so the technical part was the biggest challenge, and that's still a challenge. But I think as a graduate student, what I then realized was maybe a bigger challenge was communicating. So it's like, well, I kind of had built enough fundamental knowledge from college and first year, let's say, of graduate school to answer some of the technical questions I was trying to answer. But then I had to figure out how do I communicate what I've learned effectively? How do I write it up in a way that other people will understand, appreciate, build upon? So the communication was the hardest part. And then I was fortunate that I figured out how to communicate technical results fairly quickly. I think it didn't take me long to get some sense of how to do that well. And I had lots of people that taught me. So then I think, towards the latter part of graduate school and continuing, I think what the biggest challenge is actually asking the right question. So early on, you're probably used to working through homework assignments. The teacher's just asking, okay, here's the problem, go solve it. In college, similar thing. Instructors will ask you, hey, here's the problem, why don't you go solve it? They'll maybe start to ask you to think about, hey, if the question had been this instead, why might that be interesting? Or why might that not make sense? They might start to ask you to think about what the question should be. The business of research is asking good questions. And so I'd say at this point, that's the most interesting challenge. And it's certainly not one that I or really anyone else ever truly overcomes. I think it's something that we're constantly working on.
Yeah, okay. So, in contrast to the last question, what do you enjoy most about research?
I enjoy a lot of parts of it, but the part that I enjoy the most is the people. at this point. I think the problems that I've chosen to focus on, I described already, are fascinating to me, and parts of them are things that I can't explain why I find them fascinating, but I do find them fascinating. But to be honest with you, it's the people that I work with. So as a graduate student, that was the other people in the lab, my PhD advisor, my postdoc advisor, but now it's the students that I work with. They're fantastic to work with, and that's honestly why I'm still doing it.
Yeah, that's really nice. So I know that you've just talked about your graduate, like a research advisor, but what person or mentor in your field has made the biggest impact on you?
Well, yeah, it's easily my graduate PhD advisor. Her name was Claire Tomlin. She's fantastic. So I can't say enough positive things. Had a huge impact, certainly on the topics that I chose to investigate, but probably more important, she had a huge influence on how I start to ask questions, how I analyze the things I hear other people asking, the work I see other people presenting. She influenced how I view that. She influenced certainly how I communicate. And now that I'm a professor running a research lab, I kind of lean on what I saw from her when I sort of interact with my own students and try to model, what good research looks like and what the proper attitude is to have and when approaching a new problem, even when processing feedback that we get from others in the community. Just all of these things are things that I learned from her.
She sounds amazing.
That's true.
Were there any pivotal moments in your research career that made you change topics or want to pursue a certain topic?
Yeah, so I did actually. I switched a few times. So earlier in college, I mentioned I was working for a summer and actually afterward in a laser lab. So I started off thinking I was very interested in physics. And so it was sort of natural to get into optics and light propagation and study that. I thought that was fascinating, but I guess maybe midway through college, I took a course in signal processing, which is a core electrical engineering class at most universities. And I just found it just really exciting, really fascinating. It's kind of an applied math course. It has connections to physics, for example, but it's not really about the natural world. It's more about the mathematics underlying how we process information. And I found that really fascinating. So I ended up kind of getting into signal processing and image processing a little bit later in college. I thought that was the area I wanted to work in. And I eventually decided to go to graduate school for a PhD and continued working on these sorts of image processing and computer vision topics for a year and actually a year and a half. Towards the end of that first year or so in the PhD program, I was spending all day long thinking, how do I build a nice representation for the 3D world around me from sensors that I have? Let's say I have some cameras. I'd like to figure out what the geometry of the world around me that I'm taking pictures of, what it looks like. And so we build these very pretty representations of volume, 3D kind of maps, if you will. And I'd just be staring at them. They're very pretty, but I'm like, man, this is kind of useless. Like, what am I going to do with this? Right. And I mean, it's a little naive, but I kind of kept asking, like, so what do I do with this pretty picture? And the conclusion I came to was I saw people talking about robotics and autonomous sort of navigation of a map. And I thought, oh, that sounds very interesting. That sounds like a good way to use this kind of information. But I'm actually more interested in how to use the map than how to build the map. So I got into robotics. I thought that was the area I wanted to work in. And that interest got me into the broader area of optimal decision making, which is how I ended up where I am.
That's really cool. So I know that like right now there's a lot of new technology being developed, especially with all of like the new AI. But where do you see your research field expanding to? And also like what are some interesting topics that can be further explored within like the next 10 years?
Yeah, let me maybe answer that a few ways. So specifically, the work that I've mentioned is sort of my lab's primary focus on applied game theory. I think that this has a few directions of expansion, but maybe expansion isn't the right word. So I wouldn't think of it as expansion as much as it is finding problems that people have or issues that people really care about, which are good matches for the techniques that we're building already. So I don't think about it as I'm working in a field that's just growing like gangbusters and everybody and their brother wants to work in. It's more like I'd rather find the perhaps few but important problems that I can say something intelligent about, with the work we're doing. So with that in mind, some of those areas that I'm particularly excited about would be, I've mentioned traffic as like one application. We're driving in traffic, emerging lanes. That's something that got me into this topic actually. Something else would be like medical applications. I have several colleagues that work on robot-assisted surgery, and one of the problems that I heard them discussing at one point was how can they design a kind of a haptic interface for a master surgeon to train an apprentice. So, part of doing that well, I think they were describing at least boils down to figuring out do they see the blood vessel they're about to rupture? Are they even paying attention? Have they been standing up for too long? Are they just losing focus? Basically, the automated system ought to understand something about the motivation, intention, observation that governs how the user is going to behave. And I think that you can actually use game theory to frame that problem and solve the game, find an equilibrium of the game to basically design the interface. So that's like a very medical application. I think it also the same kind of premise could apply. You could imagine it for like designing a better lane tracing assistance in my car, something like that. I think there's applications that I'd like to see explored in, I mentioned energy also before, like in the energy sector. Obviously, I think it's not a surprise when you hear game theory to think of economics or finance, but I'd like to see those applications too. Anyway, I think it's not so much expansion, but exploration of those topics.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. So, like, what are some different institutions that you've worked at? And also, how were those experiences?
So I mentioned my undergraduate was at Princeton and my PhD was at Berkeley. I was also a postdoc at Stanford for about a year, and then I've been at UT since fall of 2021 for 3 years now. I've really loved all of those schools. They're all different. They all kind of have their own character to them. Princeton is a much smaller school than Berkeley or UT. Stanford's also relatively small, but has a much bigger kind of professional school, kind of law school, medical school, business school than Princeton does. There's obviously geographic differences, but I honestly don't think the geographic differences, say all that much about the institutions. It's more just the size, the scale. Princeton is a place that's when I was there, maybe I'm 10 years out of date, I guess. But, when I was there, it was a very quiet academic place. I think as an undergrad, the focus, at least as an engineering undergraduate, we always had was that the mantra was, hey, if you can do the problem sets all on your own, you're not in the right class, you should take a harder class. So I really valued that attitude. It was a very collaborative place, very supportive. I don't really have a similar story for any of the other places because I wasn't an undergrad there. But as a grad student at Berkeley, it was, it's like the opposite. It was a huge, flagship state school, which was a fantastic place to be a graduate student because it meant the department was much larger. There were many more researchers to interact with, great ideas floating around. And in my specific area, it's also a fantastic place. I described my advisor already, but there are many other great, well-known researchers in the area too. Yeah, anyway, all of the schools have just great things about them. I've liked each of them.
Okay. So, how did you find your passion for research, and how would you suggest like a high schooler try to find their passion?
You got to try a lot of things. So at least that's what I did. I described my path a little bit, starting in laser optics and ending up in control theory and game theory. So I only got there by kind of just jumping in, trying things, not being afraid to change direction when there was an interesting thing coming along, or I could kind of detect that I was not as well suited to a topic. So I think the name of the game is just like treat yourself as a free agent. That'd be my advice. Like if you're even thinking about research as a high school student, you're probably already fairly high achieving, doing well in your classes. Like what you should do is just follow your passions. Like don't take no for an answer. Like if you can't make a connection with somebody who's experienced already, that's normal. But the internet is a big place and you can find all kinds of resources, blog posts, academic literature, papers, anything. And there's like no reason to be bored. You should just follow the areas you think are exciting and don't settle for just scratching the surface. If you're actually excited about something, you should be excited enough to dig deeper.
Yeah, okay. So, what kind of skills do you think a high schooler could develop even if they don't have access to a wet lab?
My opinion or my answer here is going to be biased by my own kind of research. I don't have a wet lab. The closest to that I have is both as a graduate student and now as a professor. Occasionally our research projects will have a physical robot that we demonstrate the idea on. But even in those cases, the work I do, the intellectual part of it has nothing to do with the physical hardware, the physical world, the physical lab. There might be computing resources that we use. There might be, as I said, physical robots that we use to collect data or demonstrate some kind of algorithm on. So those are great, but you don't need those things in order to engage with the intellectual part, to ask the right questions, to build your answers. So I guess, if you're a high school student without access to a wet lab, my advice would be seeing if you have any interest in topics that don't require a physical lab. And, as you mentioned AI earlier, that's a great example, purely computational stuff. You can easily learn to program on your computer. Even as a high school student, if you can like write your own little neural network training tool chain and pick your favorite programming language, that's already going to give you like a great understanding of how those tools work. And sure, the thing you built is not going to be practical. Nobody's going to use it. Nobody in a real company is going to want to use it, but it's gonna teach you how things work. And it's going to give you the ability to understand the tools that you'll later use. That's something I kind of always tried to be good about doing through college and graduate school, was kind of just occasionally having a little side project like that. So I would definitely recommend doing those kinds of things.
Okay, so just really taking advantage of all the opportunities that like are available to you.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I mean, something that, we used to say, at least when I was in college, like at that time, Arduinos had just come out. These little programmable boards, you could use like a stripped down version of the C programming language to program these boards. And, they'd make them light up. They'd have all kinds of extensions that you could kind of turn on and off ports. You could plug them into your TV. You could do all kinds of interesting stuff. We were all thinking like, wow, we really wish these things had been around when we were in like middle school. Like they're so easy to use. It's like $30. It's pretty cheap, and support online for using them is very good. There's good community of people. So we were all thinking like, wow, like this is an electrical engineer's dream. Like, and I think things have only improved since then. That was 10 years ago. So be aware of what's out there. Don't take no for an answer.
And then what traits do you think define a great researcher in their field? And also like what type of traits are you looking for in a potential lab member?
Yeah, so I think for both of those, I was describing what some of the challenges were, at least that I had kind of worked my way through some of them over time. I think the most important challenge, and the thing that I maybe look for the most and look up to the most, is the ability to ask good questions. I think that's the sign of somebody who really knows what they're doing. And this is, I think, a better sign even than if you see somebody who's clearly very technically strong, somebody who's, very good at math, very good with the technical material. I have a lot of respect for somebody like this, but I also have even more respect sometimes for people who can just really put their finger on an interesting question. I think that's a sign of a great researcher. It's something that you really build that skill as a PhD student. So it's something that I look for. When I interview graduate students, I look for that. I'm certainly not perfect at detecting it, but I think that's always something I have in the back of my head. I try to see if somebody can ask good questions. That's what I'd say.
Okay. And then just for our final question, what type of advice would you give to a high schooler who's looking to go into research?
Ask good questions. It's things I've already been saying. Ask good questions. Like, don't just sit on your hands when you're bored. Like, go and learn stuff. Don't just scratch the surface. If you're actually interested in something intellectually, don't stop when you read a blog post and can give the two-sentence summary of something. Like, no, 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 actually go and learn how it works. Like, code it up yourself, whatever it is. That's the main advice.
Okay. So that's all the questions that I have for today. Thank you so much for meeting with me.
Certainly.